You go before us. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadows. You win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. And Almighty fortress, you go before us. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadows. You win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. So when I fight on my knees with my hands lifted high. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. Every fear I lay at your feet. I'll sing through the night. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. And oh God, the battle belongs to you. Amen. Amen. Aren't you glad that He's there for our battles this morning? Amen.
This reading is from the Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 1 through 18. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Now there in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in his condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," an invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. I am trying to get in. Someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to him, the man who has been said to the man who has been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick up your mat and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd and that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. So because Jesus was doing things on the Sabbath, the Jews persecuted him. Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working." For this reason, the Jews tried to all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his Father, making himself equal with God.
Ron read for us John chapter 5, and we are in our series, Signs and Miracles. Today we're looking at a Sabbath healing. Our gospel story has a miracle take place, doesn't it? Jesus comes across this man who had been lame for some 38 years. Doesn't tell us how old he was, but this was probably most of his life. And he was at this pool in Jerusalem called Bethsaida. The pool was visited by the sick and the invalid. Don't know if it was like a hot springs pool or something, but they thought that this pool had healing properties. And at the very least, if it was like a hot springs and you're lame, you get in, I get in my hot tub and my back's hurting, I get out, it's like, ooh, this feels great, you know, I'm ready to go. So Jesus asked this man in verse 6, do you want to get well? Just like many others in the Gospel of John, this man doesn't really get what Jesus means. Because he says in verse 7, sir, I have no one to help me in the pool when the water's stirred. And while I'm trying to get in, somebody else goes in ahead of me. And he might have been thinking that Jesus was there asking him if he wanted help to get into the pool. This man interprets Jesus' questions through his own beliefs about healing and it can be accomplished. And he thought if he could only get into the water, he could be healed. But we know, of course, that Jesus had something entirely different in mind than helping him into the pool. Because he tells the man in verse 8, get up, pick up your mat and walk. And the guy does. He immediately is healed and he gets up and he takes his mat and he walks away. I mean, think about that. This guy has been lame for 38 years. Jesus says, get up. He gets up, picks up his mat and walks. And up until this point in the story, everything tells us that it's just another typical miracle healing. There's the same setup. There's an encounter between Jesus and someone that's in need of healing and the healing itself. I mean, we've looked at a couple of these before, but for most of the results of Jesus' healing was belief. So we'd expect the same thing here, right? But this guy did nothing, and Jesus healed him. It didn't say he believed, and Jesus healed him. Jesus said, pick up your mat and walk, and he picked up his mat and walked. And then in verse 9 we read, and this took place on the Sabbath. A Sabbath. The sentence is almost looks like a punchline here, that it's a way of delivering the significance of what Jesus did here, because there was no belief. There was no transformation of the man's life. Jesus said, pick up your mat and walk, and he walked. But it took place on the Sabbath. And we can think to ourselves that, so this is what the story is. So the sign in our story is not that Jesus healed this man, but that he did so on the Sabbath. This one straightforward little line, this seemingly innocent sentence, introduces a conflict. And it's the first major conflict in John's Gospel between Jesus and the religious authorities. The conflict initially arises not because Jesus healed the man, but because the man was carrying his mat. See, Sabbath law prohibited such an action because it was work to carry one's mat. As the leaders in our story say in verse 10, it's the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat. But the man committed a Sabbath violation, and that's why the Jewish authorities were objecting. And so I want to give you a little bit of background here. You see, in first century Judaism, they defined community identity around three practices: circumcision, food laws, and the Sabbath observance. See, in Jesus' time, the challenge to the Sabbath had a challenge to the definition of their covenant membership. More than this, these laws had shaped their worldview. These laws were the lens through which they looked and understood themselves and their world and their relationships with one another, and most significantly, how they understood their relationship with God. Following the law was obedience and meant that you had divine favor. To disobey the law meant that you were outside the realm of God's mercy and truth. So needless to say, for these Jews, there was much more at stake in their view of this simple carrying the mat. A Sabbath violation was serious business to them, and that was all they could see. But we need to be careful because Sabbath observant was a command from God. The Sabbath itself wasn't the problem, it was the interpretation and the implementation of the law that was the real problem. See, they had the letter of the law down right, but they missed the spirit of the law entirely. For example, in the Mosaic law, one of the commandments was to keep the Sabbath holy, which meant that the Jews were not to work on Saturday. But to clarify this, the Jewish scholars created some 39 separate different categories of what work meant. And within those 39 categories of what work meant, there were thousands of subcategories. So to follow the rule of not working on the Sabbath, there were literally thousands of sub-rules. Things like how many steps you could take. If you took more than 49 steps, you were working, and you had to stop where you were. Or how many letters you could write. Because if you wrote too many, you were working on the Sabbath. Their view was so limited, so tightly wound around the following of the rules and regulations that they could no longer see the very reasons for the rules and regulations. The law was not there to be followed for its own sake, but it was there to promote love of God and love of neighbor. And to highlight the attitude of the belief at that time, one commentator writes, he says, although life-saving healing would have been permissible on the Sabbath, the healing of a disease that had lasted some 38 years surely could have waited until sometime. Right? But they were so intent on preserving this tightly controlled Sabbath observance that they just couldn't permit the healing. But of course, Jesus says in Mark 2:27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But the Jewish authorities failed to see that. The problem, too, is that the Jewish leaders were not even consistent with their rules. There was inconsistencies between their teachings and their practices, and Jesus points this out in Luke chapter 13, verses 14 and 15. There, Jesus heals a woman on the Sabbath, and when the leaders of the synagogue objected, saying, there are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath. And Jesus answers and he says, you hypocrites. He says, do not each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or your donkey from the manger and lead it away to water? And now ought this woman, a daughter of Abraham, who stayed bound for some 18 years, be set free from bondage on the Sabbath? I mean, he was saying you could untie your donkey to set him free from bondage. Why can't I set this woman free? And the leaders were unwilling to see that. They were willing to water their animals, but they were unwilling to allow healing to take place. And notice both in our text, in the conversation with the man who was healed, and with Jesus, the Jewish leaders seemed to ignore the healing itself and completely focus on just the issue of the Sabbath. Whether they believed that the healing took place or not, we don't know, because it wasn't an issue for them. They looked past it to the other details, sort of. Because eventually the Jewish authorities learned that it was Jesus who told this man to carry his mat. And the man, after he encounters Jesus in the temple, he goes to these leaders and he tells them, hey, it was that guy, the guy who's speaking in the temple, it was Jesus. He's the guy who healed me. And so notice in verse 15 that he doesn't tell them Jesus is the one who told him to pick up his mat. He tells them Jesus is the one who healed me. His focus was on the healing. We could sort of say this guy was just giving his witness, right? But when the authorities finally learned that it was Jesus, they began to persecute him because he was doing the violations on the Sabbath. The story movement seems to suggest that they more or less forgot about the healed man. They were no longer concerned about him picking up his mat and walking. They were after Jesus now. They set it into action that they wanted to squarely focus on how Jesus did and how they could respond with persecution. Jesus' response is simply yet profound, because he says in verse 17, "My Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working." What did he mean by that? In a way, Jesus completely ignores their concerns about the Sabbath violation, and he shifts his topic to something completely different. He shifts the topic to his relationship with the Father. Yet in a way, he really doesn't, because you see in our story, there's really two conversations that are taking place. The Jews have been pursuing a conversation about the Sabbath, and Jesus and the healed man are pursuing a conversation about being made well. And Jesus' words in verse 17 addresses both issues. He addresses the issue of work, the pivot of the Jews' concern about Sabbath violation, but he does so to speak about his relationship with the Father, not to teach about the Sabbath. If God continues to work on the Sabbath, giving and sustaining life, so does Jesus, he says. And it seems Jesus takes this opportunity as one to speak about his identity and his unique relationship with the Father, not to teach about the law. Essentially, rather than take the time to explain the real meaning of the Sabbath and why this kind of healing should have been allowed, Jesus says instead, whether you like it or not, I have the authority to do this because of who I am in relationship with God the Father. But of course, this is a lesson about the Sabbath, isn't it? Because Jesus is essentially saying, if you want to understand what is and isn't permissible in the Sabbath, watch me. He says, I have the authority from God himself. I instituted the Sabbath. You need to learn what the Sabbath is all about from me, he says. And several times in the other Gospels, we hear these questions. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save or to kill? Jesus' answer, as far as John's Gospel is concerned, Jesus' response is like the one from Matthew 2:27. So the Son of Man is even Lord of the Sabbath. So in this case, if Jesus himself is the one who defines Sabbath keeping, then it is a lesson about the Sabbath. It's a lesson about the relationship between the priority of religious practice versus the priority we place on the needs of people. However, for Jesus to say here what he does say, to put his work on the same level as God the Father, to the Jews, that was blasphemy. Violating Sabbath was one thing, but making yourself equal with God, that was something entirely different. And they began to plot to kill Jesus. Years of obstinate thinking hardened their hearts to the voice of God. They were unable to discern God's voice then when Jesus was speaking, and they were unwilling to consider that Jesus could have been the Messiah, the Son of God. And since they couldn't see God in Jesus, they were also unable to see the significance of what Jesus was doing in healing on the Sabbath. See, all they saw was a violation of God's law. And they were so stuck in the mud with regulations and rules that they were simply incapable of hearing anything except what they've been telling themselves for centuries. And so when God sent his Son to reveal himself to them, all they saw was someone violating the very divine law they believed themselves to be in charge of protecting and maintaining. Blind to all else, they failed in the basics. Love God and love your neighbor. Their theology had become too narrow to accommodate Jesus' compassionate act of healing, much less accept the fact that he was the coming Messiah. So here's a few thoughts that we can apply to ourselves today. Number one, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So for us then, rule keeping and religious practice is not in itself important, but only as it has significance, as it demonstrates our love for God and others. Do you get that? See, the greatest commandment is to love God and to love your neighbor. and all the other commandments are included under this one. All other regulations, all rules and commandments are meant to be specific examples and applications of how to live out this love in the conditions of everyday life. Jesus acted almost spontaneously out of the compassion when he healed this lame man. And that's the right way to respond to genuine human need. There's no wrong time or occasion to show love for others. As soon as our religious practices get in the way of showing love, something has gone dreadfully wrong. No wonder Jesus tells the leaders later in the same chapter that you don't have the love of God in you. See, they were more concerned with following the rules and the regulations than they were about helping someone. That means nothing we do as a church, whatever the significance or the practices might be, nothing should come in the way of us showing our love for others. Amen? Nothing should come in the way of us showing our love for God or our neighbors. If anything does, then we render null and void the meaning or the practices themselves, because only in the context of the great commandment of love do such practices have meaning. If we don't have love, we have nothing at all. Paul's great declaration on love in the context of congregational worship in 1 Corinthians 13 illustrates that for us. Number 2, the Jewish leaders in our story make Jesus their enemy because he threatens their power and authority for the very perception of reality. The defense of the Sabbath is a defense of an entire system of ordering life and religious practice. It's the defense of a particular understanding of how God belongs in the human experience and membership in a religious community. Since they have too much to lose if Jesus is allowed to redefine God's presence in the world, they chose to eliminate him as a threat. And the rejection of Jesus in this story is then a rejection of the possibility of new and unprecedented ways of knowing who God is and ordering a life of faith. I've heard it said many times in the church, oh, we can't change that. That's a tradition. We cannot go that way. We cannot allow that to happen. Because this healing miracle, it acts as a controversy, a catalyst for this controversy. It represents a challenge of an understanding of how our world is ordered and how God can only act in the midst of that world. See, the Jews' focus on the challenge is the controversial order and understanding, while Jesus is focused on this man and the new possibilities manifested in the man's new life. See, I think Jesus continues to challenge all of us on how or why we do what we do in church. Let's say that again. Jesus continues to challenge all of us on how or why we do what we do in church. So we as a church today, we're invited by this text to examine when and by why whom the knowledge of God brought by Jesus is rejected because it's too challenging to the existing institutions or religious systems. Do our practices and activities point to Jesus? Or are we doing things because we're doing them out of a sense of duty? Are we doing them out of a sense of love for him? Or are we doing things because we've always done that? If our worldview is so limited that we can no longer hear God through Jesus, and we start focusing on what we're doing, then we've lost our way. Can you grasp that? Number 3, all of our practices ought to be centered around Jesus. Our focus is Christ. All of our practices, all of our rituals, all the ways in which we do church only have significance to the degree that they enable us to live a life, a Christian life, and to walk with Christ. The reality of the incarnation of God's ability and presence in Jesus is the defining mark of a believing community, not only for John, not only for the defense of his particular practices, but Jesus came to reveal the Father. He came to make God known and to make the love of God available for everyone, so that we can invite anyone to come to him and be satisfied to follow him. To come and see and taste and see that the Lord is good. So we begin this week that following this path, revealing God for who he is. It doesn't always lead to acceptance. Jesus is largely rejected. Jesus, you might say, from a human point of view, is remarkably unsuccessful in his mission. Yet the Jesus way, the way that we are called to embrace and make our own way, the way of power and weakness, the way of the cross, we see as our story hints that Jesus' mission and preaching would ultimately lead to his death. But little did these authorities know that the plotting and executing the plan to murder Jesus was that they were fulfilling the plan of God to bring salvation to the world. That through his death would mean life. Resurrected life, new life, eternal life, living water for the thirsty, and bread for those who are hungry. The Son reveals the Father's love and mercy by going to the cross. And we celebrate that today. One last thought, never give anyone a chance to accuse us of playing church. Don't ever let anybody accuse you that you're just being religious, because it's not about religion. It's about a relationship. Don't let anyone ever suggest that we allow the practices and the rituals of church get in the way of love. Never give anyone a chance to say that we failed to show love of Jesus for the sake of how we do church. Instead, let's give people the only chance that truly matters, the chance to see the love of God embodied in all of us. For we are the body of Christ. He is the head. Let us never be so preoccupied by what we do that we're unwilling or to overlook someone in need, or an act of compassion, or an act of love. Let all of our activities be so transparent to the love of God and Jesus that people cannot see this love, but desire to know what you have. That you have a relationship with something that they don't even think about. So stand with us.
I've always aimed higher, don't let me off the hook. We wrote a chapter, haven't finished the book. The high road's the hard one, but doesn't it feel right? I wish I didn't have to leave, but that doesn't mean I'll stay. I've heard